So both say we are now on the tail end, so to speak, of this Tosfos, this gigantic Tosfos, Samaches Amid Beis, the Masechet Katan. Now, just to review 2 points, and then we'll jumpstart where we left off last week. Umiyu Kasha, if you count about 10 lines up from the bottom, and Tosfos asks the following Kasha. The Gemara says in Ksubis that Ger Katan matbilano saldas bezdin. Now, until this point, Tosfos assumed that there's no schia to a katan because schia is mitam what, everybody? Shlichus, correct? And a katan is lavar shlichus. And therefore, Tosfos says that the only way you could come up with a Ger Katan on a doraisa level would have to be with an aku muberes, so when who's muberes. But the Gemara in Ksubis is otherwise. The Gemara says that Ger Katan matbilano saldas bezdin, and that's a gerus doraisa l'chol dinim. How can it be? It can only be based on Zoch Li'ad Mishlo B'fanav. And yet, there's no schia to a katan. Now, you may argue that it's not really a gerus in the strict sense of the word. Maybe we're talking about Yesh Kof Yad Chachamim, Lakar Dov Min HaTorah B'kum V'aseh, and therefore the Chacham consider him as a Jew when he's not really Jewish according to the Torah law, because there's no schia to a katan, because katan doesn't have shlichus. Tosfos says that's a very unintelligible position. You cannot maintain that position. First of all, the Gemara says in Yevamis that Yesh Kof Yad Chachamim Lakar Davar Min HaTorah B'Shei B'Altaseh, not B'Kum V'aseh. And secondly, the Gemara asks, "My Kamashwan Tnina." What do you mean, "My Kamashwan Tnina"? You're telling me an unbelievable chiddush that Zechiyah doesn't operate, but we made him poof magically into a ger. And we will matir all these surah that apply to a guy, and we consider him like a Jew. So therefore, we must assume that Ger Katan matbilano saldas bezdin is doraisa. And the question is, how can it be doraisa since we don't have zechia by a katan? So Tosfos, just to review what we said last time, says that this zechia is unlike any zechia that we're familiar with, because, as Tosfos points out, who be atzmo ubegufo naseger. We don't actually do a maisa that relates to him. He does the maisa itself. He jumps into the mikvah. All right, you didn't like that word. Okay, he goes into the mikvah. Okay, sorry. Okay, anyway, the point is that he does the tefillah himself. So we suggested that maybe Tosfos is operating with a new din of zechia that's not predicated on shlichus, and we are zocher on his behalf through our das. He does the Maisa Tefillah and Mila Begufo. But we don't think that that's the way Tosfos is going here, because in the next line in Tosfos raised the following question. V'had park b'ksubos, Tanina, we already know Zach li'olam shel b'fanov, u'meshani ma'od tema ovi kochav v'efkeren nicholei. So Tosfos now is bothered by the fact that the Gemara is operating with midin zechia. Apparently, Tosfos holds that this cannot operate midin zechia. Otherwise, what's bothering Tosfos? Again, I'm making a big deal, excuse me, about the words "v'had parach b'ksubas tnina zachli adam shel b'fanav." There's something in that line in the Gemara in Ksubas that irks Tosfos, irritates Tosfos. Now, if Tosfos understanding that here we have a schia doraisa on behalf of the katan, because it's not through shlichus, because it's not our maisa that relates to the katan himself does the maisa, then what bothers Tosfos about the Gemara that says Zach li'odem shel b'fanav? And not only that, Tosfos is going to give an answer that you know what it means over there in the Gemara. The Gemara is saying that we need to be convinced that it's a zechus for him to become a Jew, because otherwise, lo hayel bezdin lismatze, Bezdin wouldn't get involved in this. Now, if we're dealing with Zach li'odem shel b'fanav, then what are you telling me that ein lo bezdin lismatze? That's a ridiculous statement. If it's a chova, then there's no Zach li'odem shel b'fanav. There's no zachin without a zchus. If it's a chova, so the Gemara is telling me, according to Tosfos, that I might think it's a chova, and therefore Bezdin shouldn't get involved, as if to say Bezdin could get involved, and we could operate with Zach and the other Shlo B'fanav. That's where we got stuck. And what we suggested at the end of Shia last week was the following: that Tosfos is not operating with Zach and the other Shlo B'fanav, but there's some sort of, shall we say, authority or power that's vested in Bezdin, that Bezdin can be Megayer this Katan. And it doesn't operate midin Zach and the other Shlo B'fanav. And that's what Tosfos is bothered by. Why does the Gemara say, Tnina, Zach and the other Shlo B'fanav? We're not operating with Zach and the other B'fanav. And Tosfos thinks that there is no Zach and the other Shlo B'fanav by a Katan. So what was bothering the Gemara here when the Gemara said, Tnina, we already have it, Zach and the other Shlo B'fanav? Well, we're not dealing with Zach and the other Shlo B'fanav. That's what bothers Tosfos. So again, if Gerus would be based on Zach Li'Odav B'fanav, then everything's wonderful. The Gemara is asking a very great question here. What did Rav Huna tell me? Ger Katan Bilan Osal Das Bezin. I don't need Rav Huna to tell me Zach Li'Odav Shalom B'fanav.
You should have to explain how is this Zach Li'Odav Shalom B'fanav. There's no shlichus here. You're not doing anything that's on his behalf.
Right, but we suggest that maybe even without shlichus, maybe there's a kind of Zach Li'Odav Shalom B'fanav that works for a Katan without shlichus, meaning the nafkamina between Zachin when there is shlichus, which means when the mezakeh does the ma'isa on behalf of the zocher, and a case of Zachin Li'Odav Shalom B'fanav without shlichus, where the zocher himself does the ma'isa, the nafkamina is going to be Katan. Why? Because if you're operating in the framework of what Zachin Li'Odav Shalom B'fanav did shlichus, because the ma'isa of the mezakeh relates to the Zocha, then it cannot work for a Katan. The Katan doesn't have shlichus. And then we're back to square one. So we must be assuming a new parsha of Zechiyah, Shalom Itam shlichus, where the Zocha does the Ma'is himself. He doesn't need the Mezakeh to do the Ma'is on his behalf. He only needs the Zocha and the Adam for the Das, that the Mezakeh supplies the Das that generates the clinches the Chalos. But then, if Tosfos is operating within Zocha and the Adam Shalom B'fanav, then the Gemara in Ksubis fits like a glove. There's no reason to object and raise any problems from the Gemara in Ksubis. The Gemara is saying, well, you're operating with Zach and the other Shalom B'fanav. Well, guess what? We know that from Tanaic sources. We don't need Rav Huna as an Amora to teach me Zach and the other Shalom B'fanav. That's why I submit to you that although I thought our shot was very exciting, but it's not Tosfos. Tosfos is operating outside of the framework of Zach and the other Shalom B'fanav. And that's why he's tremendously bothered by the Gemara when it raises the question, Tnina, Zach and the other Shalom B'fanav. We're not operating here with Zach and Shalom B'fanav. And Tosfos holds there's no second category of Zachin which is not predicated on Shlichus. That was double negative. In other words, all of Zechiyah is predicated on Shlichus. And all of his chiyah applies to a gadol and not to a katan, because a katan cannot have shlichus. And the din of Bezdin in terms of Ger Katan is a different kind of halacha altogether. It completely circumvents the law of zechiyah. It's not operating within zechiyah. And Bezdin is going to decide to be megayer a katan, and therefore, if it's not working within Zach and the other Shalom B'fanav, then Tosfos has a problem, because the Gemara says, wait a minute, Rav Huna is just he's reiterating what we know from Mishnayos, namely that Zach and the other Shalom B'fanav, and that was the Gemara's kasha. Well, Tosfos doesn't understand. What is the Gemara asking? We're not operating within Zach and the other Shalom B'fanav. And therefore, Tosfos answers that okay, we're not operating within Zach and the other Shalom B'fanav, and we're operating within the framework of Bezdin being Megayer a Katan. Fine, Bezdin's could be Megayer a Katan. Why? Why did Bezdin wake up one morning and decide to be Megayer a Katan? And the answer is because it's not a chova for the Katan, but rather it's a schus for a Katan. to become Jewish. And therefore, if it would have been L'chovaso, they shouldn't have gotten involved. But since the Gemara comes to the conclusion that it's a schus, therefore Bezdin gets involved. So let's just summarize. The bottom line of this Tosfos, the way we're interpreting this Tosfos, is that Bezdin could be Magayer, a guy, and that is going to operate on a Doraisa level. And if you ask me why would Bezdin get involved in such a thing, then the answer is because it's a schus for the Katan. If it were a chova for the Katan, Bezdin wouldn't get involved. If you ask me, are we operating within the framework of Zoch L'Yodam Shalom Fanav, the answer is a flat no. We do not have Zoch L'Yodam with regard to a Katan. And even though the Katan himself is going into the mikvah, but nevertheless, I still would have to come up with a parsha of Zachin, which was never formulated with regard to a Katan. Now, Rabosa, I want to take a little break here and tell you that there's another way in which Bezdin could be, or I shouldn't say Bezdin, but we could be Magayer Katan. The only problem is, can I find where's my page here? Just give me a second. Maybe I left it in my briefcase. Maybe I left it at home.
One of us took it.
What do you say?
One of us took it.
It's Rishimo Shirim on Yavamis. I'll have to say it from memory, but do we have a Rambam Sefer Kinyan here? At least I could read the Rambam to you. Yeah, you don't mind? Probably find the page after the Shir, but so let me just try an experiment here.
We require this after the Katan because he can't have that to like have proper kavanah for the tefillah. Is that where we need it? Because otherwise, why would we need the choices? Not much some Ger to do tefillah. Like, why would we need some kind of?
Very fast. Thank you so much. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Say it again.
Why do we need to worry about any of the steer in Yan? So it says the Ger does has to get tefillah and go to the mikvah. So he does that. That automatically.
Well,
because he doesn't have proper kavanah because he's a katan, so he doesn't have proper kavanah for gerus when he does the tefillah. Is that really the base?
Well, I wouldn't say I wouldn't use the word kavanah. I'll tell you why. Kavanah is something that belongs to like the realm of mitzvahs. Again, there might be a mitzvah to be megayrika, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a chalos gerus. We're talking about a change in the entire status of a guy to transform him into Yisrael. So for that, we need das, and if we need das, where's the das coming from? So, if you don't mind, instead of kavanah, if you could just use the word das. So I'm just saying that we thought that maybe through Zachar L'Yodam Shalom Fanav, we could supply the das, but I'm just telling you that from Tosfos Kasha and also from the language of Tosfos, Ein LeBezdin L'Smatzeh, he's not talking about Zachar L'Yodam, because if he was talking about Zachar L'Yodam, then for sure we have to guarantee that it's not a chova, but rather it's a schus. Oh, very frustrating. Anyway, so the Rav in the Shiurim on Masechet Yevamos said over a chiddush of Reb Chaim, and Reb Chaim is based on the Rambam. The Rambam is at the end of Perek Ches Mehilchas Avodah. The Rambam says the following: Yisrael shetokaf b'goy katan. So he grabs onto a goy katan, or shemotza tino goy, or he finds an abandoned child, a goy, vitbilo. Now, why was he matbil him? Either l'shem ger, or l'shem eved, or for both. But in any event, l'shem ger hareze ger, l'shem eved hareze eved, l'shem ben chorin, which means that he wanted it to be both a ger and an eved, so that he could still use him or be meshabed him as an eved. Then he has the status of a ben chorin with rights to be meshabed him. In any event, Reb Chaim raised the following question. The Rambam seems to be talking about Ger Katan, but yet, oddly enough, the Rambam in Hilchas Isurei Bia, I believe it's in Perek Yud Aleph, don't quote me on that, the Rambam quotes the halacha of Rav Huna from Ksubas Yud Aleph, namely, that Ger Katan matbil no sal das best. Why would the Rambam repeat himself here in Hilchas Avodim? And furthermore, the Rambam in Hilchas Isurei Bia doesn't mention anything about Yisrael shetakaf goy. The Rambam in Isurei Bia says higdilu yicholim limchos. Here in Hilchas Avodim, the Rambam mentions absolutely nothing about Bezdin, nothing about Zochel Yolim Shlo B'Fanov, and nothing about higdilu yicholim limchos. The Rambam doesn't even mention a word about Bezdin over here. So obviously these are two separate halachas. Lo mi boy, because the Rambam never repeats himself. But moreover, because the Rambam is talking about a whole different set of rules and regulations. So Reb Chaim said that this is a brand new din of Gerus, and it's not based on Bezdin, and it's not based on Zochel Yolim Shlo B'Fanov. You want to know about Gerus, where Bezdin activates the principle of Zochel Yolim B'Fanov to be Magayer a Katan, go look in Isurei Bia Perek Yud Aleph. Here, the Rambam is talking about something else. There's no Bezdin. And not only that, it's takaf begoy. There's a halacha here of takaf begoy or matbil goy katan. In both cases, it's a katan, and it's yad Yisrael tkefa. That we have now control over the goyim, and any Yisrael could take this Ger Katan, this Goy Katan, and he could be Magayer him. And not only that, it's without das. It's against the will of the Goy. And it doesn't matter whether the Goy agrees or doesn't agree. It's Takaf and Kafuf Biyad Yisrael. And Reb Chaim said, in such a case, there's no Higdilu Yicholim Limchos. There's no Macha. They could be Macha if you're operating Midin Zochel Yolim Shlo B'Fanov, and then the ger says, no, this is not a schus for me, this is a chova. I don't want the gerus. So then he could completely undermine the gerus. But here, when Yisrael is takef begoy, then the gerus is initiated by the Yisrael through his tkifa, through his being, through the fact that the guy is kafuf tachas yodo, and there's no need for das. There's no das over here. It's like what shall I say? It's like being zocher in a hefker. If you make a tkifa, if you make a kinyan on something that's hefker, it's yours. And here there's a similar halacha that the Yisrael sort of like takes over the guy. They don't have shiurim l'zech abamori here. Rishimo shiurim, do they?
I wouldn't know. You need a Talmud Patalon.
Yeah. Do me a favor, David. If you don't find it, at least bring me, the Rambam La'am, because I want to show you a footnote or two. You know what I mean by the Rambam La'am? Kinyan. Yeah, I'm sure they have to have a Rambam La'am. Yeah. The only library that wouldn't have a Rambam La'am today is a library that opened up yesterday. But I think this library has been around for a while. The Pella, here's the Kesef Mishnah. The Kesef Mishnah on this Rambam writes, Zeh Pirish Rabbeinu al Masha Omru, the Perikam the Ksubis, Omra Afuna, Ger Katan Matbino Saldas Bez. It can't be. I'm a big fan of the Kesef Mishnah, don't get me wrong. But Reb Chaim is right. If the Kesef Mishnah is right, and this is the Rambam's understanding of Omar Afuna Ger Katan Matbino Saldas Bezdin, then he quotes that in Hilchas Isurei Bia. And there it's Bezdin, and there it's Higdilu Yicholim Limchos, and there it's the Rambam says explicitly Zochel Yolim Shlo B'Fanov. Here we're not talking about Bezdin, we're not talking about Higdilu Yicholim Limchos, we're not talking about Zochel Yolim Shlo B'Fanov. It's a totally different halacha. Now let's see if I can find it. You see, because I photocopied it before I came. Just 1 second. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm listening while I'm looking for the page. I told you again to find me the Ram Hilchot Sabbath. Yeah. Yeah. Speak a little loud. I didn't hear you.
Specifically about being total for as an edit.
No, it works in 3 ways. He could be tovelim as an Evid, he could be tovelim as a ger, that is a full-fledged ger, or he could be tovelim as a ben chorin with a shibud, not exactly avdus, but he could be meshabed him.
Where's that all kinds of Kenyan?
Perik Ches in Kenyan, in Hilchas Avodim, Halacha Chav. Okay, now, but just give me, can you hold on to it just for 1 minute, because I have too many for me on my table. I just want to show you the Rishima Shiurim, which I photocopied, but of course, I left it. So there's an easy way of finding it because he has a Mafter al Seder Rambam. So we'll just look up. Yeah, you have it. You have it in your phones. Okay, just 1 second. Where's al Seder? What page? Okay, tough kuf. Just 1 second. Tough kuf. It's a kuf. Kuf. Tesvav, you said? Yeah. Of kuf. Okay, so first he quotes the Rambam, then he tells you the Kesef Mishnah. Oh, I'm sorry, I said Perik Yud Aleph, it's a Perik Yud Gimel, Mehilchas Yisurei Biyah. Halacha Zayim, Vizel Shon Ger Katan Matbil No Saldas Bezdin. Discusi Lo. Madua Hevi Rama Pam Shenis Bilchas Havadim, according to Kesef Mishnah. I'm just repeating himself. The old Kasha, the Rambam in Yisurei Biyah says what? Bezdin is Megayer. And why? Because Kusi Lo V'Zochlon Shal B'Fanav. Okay, and he has another Rambam. In Perik Yud Milchas Malachim, D'may Ger Katan Pilos Aldas Bezdin Yachal Limchos. And why is Yachal Limchos? Because it's Zochlon the Old Shal B'Fanav. Umevur the Chal Gerus the Ger Katan he did Zochlon the Old Shal B'Fanav. Umishum Hachi Yigdil Yachal Limchos. B'tzarchi and the Rambam here in Hilchos Avodim completely omits Higdil Yachol Limchos. Right? Ustimis Lashona Rambam Hilchos Avodim Mashma Tokaf Akum Katan. Tokaf means, right? We said he had a grasp over him. He grabs onto him. It Bilo L'Shem Kerus. Eino Yachol Limchos Yigdil. And the Rambam should have added that in this case of Tokaf, the Katan could be mocha. If the Ram left it out, it means there's no mocha. Furthermore, he says the Rama paskins that he can be matbil the guy bal karcho and he can make him into an eved. It's hard to say that's something the other shall be fun of. That a guy would want to become an eved. And furthermore, I just want to add, there's no mention of Bezdin at all over here. Period. That's what I think he points out here. Now I'll take it from you. In the footnote,
Even an Evet has more.
Yeah, hold on.
mitzvot. Even an Evet has more mitzvot than a guy.
yeah, no, I'm not
Still,
saying
still
that,
the same way.
but I'm not sure if anyone could say that it's for sure a chus and to take a guy and make him to an evet. I don't know, possibly, but I doubt it. He points out that that the Rambam is based on Yerushalmi. That's number one. So it's not our Bavli at all in Ksubis. Again, I'm not going to go through all the sources that he quotes here, but it's irrelevant. My point only is that he's not operating with the Kesef Mishnah at all. Otherwise, he would have quoted the Bavli. He quotes the Yerushalmi. Furthermore, he's again in my copy, I underlined all this and photocopied it, but I forgot to photocopy. Anyway, Keva de Tfila Zu Shiager. Okay, fine. Ho'ila Tfila Zu. And if there'll be Mila as well, Yeh Ger Gomel. He'll be a full-fledged Ger. He says the following: the afal pisha ger katan matbil sal das bezdin. Here there's no das bezdin. But the answer is, he says, Kema Chekana Oso Chazaka, what we call Tekifa, the Rambam's language, Takaf is Chazaka. Again, it's like being Zoch ben a Hefker. He says you don't need Bezdin for that. Areu Shalov, Yochel Gairo, Afilu Shalal Das Bezdin, and we're adding Afilu Bal Karcha. And it doesn't work with Midin Zachin. And there's no Igdili Chalim Libchas. Yeah, he says explicitly, since he made a tekifa, which he calls a kinyan, v'zachabo, rashoy lasosbo b'mamono, afilu yehezel lechovasa. Ulefichach, he says beautifully, eino yachol libchos l'shiyagdil. So a lot of the diukim that Reb Chaim makes in this Rambam, he has here in the name of various, I don't know who this is, he quotes amongst others, the Radbaz, and he quotes the Yerushalmi quotes a whole bunch of sources here. Now, who is this little guy over here? He says Tinok Mushlach. The Yerushalmi calls him a Tinok Mushlach, the abandoned cradle. You remember that book? Right? It Bil Shum Eved. He says all the Shem Ben Chav, and he quotes the Or Sameach. And say it again.
Rachman also mentions Yosef.
So he has it here. By the way, this is a very good Rambam. I use it a lot. Now it's out of style already because of Frankel, but he says Tkifi bal karcho shel katan. So again, it's against his will, and it's not his chus. He says it's a whole new concept of
It's about kidnapping, right? It's not like his parents.
It's sort of like kidnapping, but this is not something that's, politically correct. I wouldn't go out and publicize this shtickle Torah, in South Africa or anywhere else on the face of the globe. It's good. Okay, then. So let me just get my bearing here. So where are we up to? Yeah. So I just want to point out here, Abosai, that since we're learning this Tosfos, and Tosfos is trying to find an opportunity for a Ger Katan Doraisa, and Tosfos came up with two possibilities. The first one was Muberish and Iskaira. And the second one is Zachin L'Odel Shelo B'Fanav, but now we're saying it's not Zachin L'Odel Shelo B'Fanav, it's Epsad Nu Halacha. And we can also mention this Rambam in Hilchos Havadim, according to Reb Chaim, that there's a new category of Ger Katan that's based on Yad Yisrael Tkefa, and he was Tokefa Katan, and he was Megayer. Okay. So again, Tosfos was bothered. V'hadar parach b'ksubas. How can you operate within Zachin? There's no Zachin for Katan. And Tosfos answers that no, the Gemara is not operating with Zachin. That's between the lines here in Tosfos. But rather, the Gemara is operating with Midin Bezdin. You see, Rabosai, it comes out like this. If you take the Rambam and Hilchos Havadim like Reb Chaim, and you take our interpretation of this Tosfos, there's something very similar to both halachas here of Ger Katan. Why? Because Bezdin is accomplishing here in Tosfos what the Yisrael is accomplishing through Tkifa in the Rambam Hilchos Havadim. In both cases, you're being Megayer Katan. And there's a power of being Megayer the Katan without Zachin L'Odel Shelo B'Fanav. In fact, there's not even Zechus over here. The only major difference is that in our sugya, based on Ksubis, the way Tosfos understands it, where Bezdin is Megayer the Katan, it can't be Bal Karcha. At some point or another, we're going to need the agreement of the Ger. And we'll see that in the Hemshech HaTosfos. That's not so for Hilchos Havadim. And the nafkamina is going to be a tremendous nafkamina because that allows for Mecha. Okay. So that's what bothers Tosfos now. So we're looking now, Rabos, at the last two lines in Tosfos. After which we should open up a bottle of schnapps. Okay? Tosa says, "V'afal gav davida b'ksubas higdilu yicholim limchos." What's bothering Tosfos?
If it's not Zechia, why do they need?
And if it's not Zechia, it means Bezdin's being Megayer him. So who cares what he says and what he doesn't say? Bezdin effectuated a chalos geris doraisa, and we don't need his das, and therefore we don't need his das. What rights or what? How do you define the concept of mecha? Where do you put mecha into the picture? It doesn't belong here at all. And I would go a step further. I would say that if you would be operating midin schia, then Tosas would not be bothered by mecha, because mecha would mean that at the first moment that he hears about the gerus, again, it doesn't mean that on the day that he hits bar mitzvah 13, he heard about the fact that he was a ger. But whenever he finds out about it, he could be mocha. So within the framework of Zachar the Adam Shalom B'fanav, is Higdil Yicholim Limchos makes sense that at some point he can make a B'cha. But if we're operating in a different vein, and it's not Midin Schia, but rather it means that Bezin could be Megayer him, so why does he have the ability to be Mocha? That's what bothers Tosfos. And in 2 words, what's going to be the answer to Tosfos? Kabbalas mitzvahs. So let's read it inside. He says, "Amrinan dichshegadla sha'achas v'lo michu shuv einam yicholim limchos." Tosfos says, don't think that we're operating here midin zachar li'olam shalom b'fanav, because in zachar li'olam shalom b'fanav there wouldn't be kevat shegdilu sha'achas. There's no such thing as sha'achas.
Anytime.
Whenever he finds out about it. If you pick up a mitzvah on my behalf, it is hefker. So whenever I find out about it, I have a right to make a mecha. 50 years from now, I can make a mecha. That's not loch of zachar the other shalom b'fanav. So what does this mean? Why not? And the answer is because we're not operating midin schia. How do I know we're not operating midin schia? Because mo'ale milu tefillah shel katnus. Because Bezdin makes sure and supervise that he should have a milah and a tefillah when he's a katan. He's a labar das. And they create a gerus begufo, right? Hoisa gerus begufo. This, let's just remember the Tosfos language earlier. Tosfos says, "Hu zocha biatzmo u begufo shenasa ger v'nichnas tachas kanfei hashchina." So obviously we're talking about being Megayer Katan. If we're being Megayer Katan, then he's not going to have an ongoing opportunity somewhere down the line that when he finds out about it, he's going to say, well, I'm making a big to-do, a protest about it, I'm kicking up the dust because we're not operating midin zachar l'shalom b'fanav. Because begufo nasager, begufo v'atzmo nasager v'nichnas tachas kanfei hashchina. So then what is the secret here of Higdilu Yicholim Limchos? The answer is Ein Chaser El Kabbalas Mitzvahs Umitosha Gadlu V'lo Michu Hainu Kabbalah. This Tosfos is amazing. How would Rav Goldberg say? Pilei Plud. Have you heard Rav Goldberg?
Yeah.
Rav Goldberg. Pilei Plaim. You got to be careful. You never know when he's going to throw something at you. He takes off his tie. And so anyway, it's all because Rabbi Moshe Dimit mitzvah all around. In any event, so here's the question. Tosfos says that what does it mean higdilu? Higdilu velo michu. Do you follow that? Velo michu. It's very fascinating. Tosfos on the one hand requires what? What was lacking in this gerus? Kabbalas mitzvahs. Now we can't have Kabbalas mitzvahs while he's a katan because he's a labar das. The very moment that we can have Kabbalas mitzvahs, we're going to supply that chisaron, that which is missing, namely Kabbalas mitzvahs.
Is it because he's labar das?
How are you going to get Kabbalas mitzvahs?
Is it because he's labar das or is lo chayav? Because he's not a gadol yet.
maybe you're right. That's another reason. But for sure, what I said is true. I think what you said is also true. But there's no possibility of Kabbalas mitzvahs as a cut. Period. Tosa says, then how could you have gerus without Kabbalas mitzvahs? And the answer has to be Higdilu Sha'achas. What happened during that Sha'achas? All Tosas reveals here, based on the Gemara Ksubis, is Lo Michu. What does that mean, Lo Michu? That's Kabbalas mitzvahs?
Well, the assumption, I guess, is that they knew and they understood.
Well, I wouldn't say they knew, they assumed, maybe they knew in Ruach HaKodesh, they had Ruach HaKodesh, but they were working with an assumption. Now, what clinches that assumption is correct? They were working with an assumption. When Bezdin was Megayer him, what were they thinking? The Bezdin, what was Bezdin thinking when they Megayer this Katan?
That's a he'll be Makabal.
That for sure he'll observe the Torah as a good Jew, right? We'll raise him as a Jew and he'll observe the Torah. So the gerus itself was a gerus al Tanai, so to speak. Almanas sheyikabel sheyamshich lios. Let's call it Yehudi Neman v'Shomer as mitzvahs. Well, were they right or not? We're going to determine whether they're right or not at one moment. There's going to be one critical crossroads, one single moment in which we're going to determine whether Bezdin was operating with the correct assumption. Did they have Ruach HaKodesh? I don't know. Let's find out. V'lo macha. What does v'lo macha mean? No, he doesn't even know he's a ger. So again, we're not talking about Kabbalah's old mitzvahs. We're talking about v'lo michu. That's the Kabbalah's mitzvahs. The Kabbalah's mitzvahs is not a positive kum v'aseh. It's not some sort of official legal declaration that he has to make in front of a bezdin, but rather lo michu. So what does he do as a 13-year-old without macha? What does he do? He puts on tefillin. All right. For example, again, I give you 613 examples or Ramak.
So why do I care?
What Tosas is saying is that if you think that he needs a Kabbalas mitzvahs for the gerus, you're making a big mistake. No, I'm just saying, if you take the words Ella, Ein Chaserin al Kabbalas mitzvahs, right, the last one. If you take that line literally, you're in deep trouble. I'll tell you why. Because if we need Kabbalas or mitzvahs, then what happens if he's not Makabal mitzvahs?
Then Michu. That's Michu.
I understand, but what does that mean for the last 13 years? Let's say.
No, the Gemara Ksubis says he goes back. He's not Makabal mitzvahs, and he goes back to the Eagle.
So it's impossible to say that he goes back to be a guy. I'll tell you why. Because if he was a ger until this point, without Kabbalah,
like you said, he's a ger. You said it was ger. It makes sense. Ger. Not Makabal mitzvahs. He goes back to the Eagle.
but again, if you need Kabbalah mitzvah,
The absence of mecha equals Kabbalah mitzvah.
right? But I'm saying, how
I don't know that you let's assume like everybody boy in 7th grade, that's Makabal mitzvah, and I have no idea that I was a ger. So what's that?
right? So that's what I'm asking.
Yes.
How can
The assumption is that they have the opportunity to be wrong.
if I could just finish the sentence, how could Kabbalah's or mitzvahs be achieved through lo macha? What do you mean lo macha? Lo macha is not a Kabbalah's mitzvahs.
If
I need a Kabbalah's mitzvahs. Where is the Kabbalah's mitzvahs? Are we going to schlep this bar mitzvah boy, so to speak, into Bezdin? Right, because gerus requires a Bezdin, so we need Mila and Tefillah. Okay, that we accomplished while he was a Katan, magically. And now we need Kabbalah's mitzvahs. So let's bring this Katan into Bezdin and fire a question at him. Are you willing to be Makabel mitzvahs? If you are, then we're going to be Megayer you. Yeah, but if we're going to be Megayer, then it's a brand new gerus. That's impossible. We're not talking about a brand new gerus. We're talking about lo michu. Lo michu could not be a formal Kabbalah's mitzvahs, because when a ger is makabel mitzvahs, he has to do so in the presence of a bezdin. just like he needs Mila and Tvila in the presence of a Bezdin. So Bezdin could be Megayer someone if all three elements were done in front of Bezdin. But we're not talking about a Bezdin here. Tosa is not saying that we're going to schlep this child when he becomes bar mitzvah to Bezdin, Igdilu, let's schlep him into Bezdin. Tosa is saying he continues in his way and he doesn't make him a cha, and that justifies our original decision to be Megayer him, Almanas, that he should continue as a Jew for the rest of his life and observe the mitzvahs. How do I know that we made a good decision? It was a good business deal. We made a good shikol hadas, because when he became a gadol, he continued to fulfill the mitzvahs. I don't need a bezdin for that. I don't even think I need Eidim for that. The very fact that he continues to do mitzvahs is itself imacha. And if it's imacha, then the original gerus continues, because Tos has two problems. If you're going to allow him, if you're going to require him to be makabel mitzvahs, and you're going to allow him to say, well, I don't want to be makabel mitzvahs, then what happens to his gerus? Until now we treated him as a ger. We ate from his shchita. Even as a katan. So you remember we discussed that a katan could do shchita if you have a gadol omin al gabo. Not a guy who does shchita is no gadol omin al gabo. Again, there could be many nafkaminas. It's hard to say. You understand? It's hard to say that we're going to start our gerus all over again, because until now we had a gerus without kabbalas mitzvahs. Now we're going to need to effectuate a gerus with kabbalas mitzvahs. So what happened to the original gerus? Where did it go? It just dissipates if he's not makabel mitzvahs.
What does it mean?
Higdil yichol libchos means he can decide, I'm not going to do mitzvahs. He can go ahead and say, I'm not putting on tefillin. If he says, I'm not putting on tefillin, then we understand that our entire enterprise of gerus was based on a false premise. We made a big mistake. We thought that he was going to continue with mitzvahs. And lo and behold, he says, I'm not interested in mitzvahs.
Is he Jewish or not Jewish? Not Jewish.
He's not Jewish, and not only that, he never was Jewish.
I don't know.
Let me. One second. I wrote myself.
He's trying to say, I want to be. He's gone. No longer Jewish. He was not Jewish. He was everything he did was fine. I was not Jewish. I always understood that. I was hoping he didn't tell me that.
That's why people came to the shit.
Yeah, could be. It seems to be saying that.
The whole Shashmat of the discovery and structure of the code, don't go back to all the shifting before, whatever.
You see, I'll tell you what happens here. Besides what I said before, that if you need a Kabbalah's mitzvos, then you need Bezdin for that. And you're going to need basically a new gerus. I'll go even beyond that. If you need a formal Kabbalah's whole mitzvahs, then don't we have to notify him that he's a guy that we were Megayer him? The poskim say you don't have to notify him. The true, yeah, true secret motion.
Okay, that's not.
I wrote extensively on this topic. I don't remember what I wrote, but don't ask me. But I can show it to you inside. But let's assume that Rav Moshe Feinstein is correct. I forget all his rayas, but he understood that Imacha does not require a Kabbalah's whole mitzvahs. If it did, then we should have to bring him into Bezdin. We should have to undergo another process of gerus, and in front of Bezdin, he has to be Makabel mitzvahs. And Imacha is not sufficient. Not only that, we'd have to notify him that he's a candidate for gerus, that he was born as a guy, and now we want to bring him into gerus, and now he could be Makabel Kabul mitzvahs and Kabul geras. Nowhere does Tosfos say that we require a bezdin for this. And nowhere does Tosfos say that we need an actual Kabbalah b'kuv vaseh, where he stands in front of a bezdin and he makes a declaration like a Maisa Gerus, right? What's a Maisa Gerus? Mila Tefillah is a Maisa Gerus. It requires what? Bezdin. Without Bezdin, there's no Maisa Gerus. If Kabbalah's mitzvahs means literally that we need we're adding a new third element of Maisa Gerus, and Kabbalah's mitzvahs is a Maisa Gerus, then that would have to be a formal declaration in front of Bezdin that I hereby accept mitzvahs. He doesn't even know that he was born a God. We don't even have to tell him that he's born a God. And all Tosfos says is imecha. So what is imecha? Imecha is a Kabbalah's mitzvahs. Just because we didn't hear a mecha, maybe he didn't make a mecha because he didn't know he was a guy. Tosfos doesn't say we have to tap him on the back and notify him of his options. Hey, buddy, now you're at a crossroads to decide whether you want to reject your gerus or accept your gerus. No. Tosfos says that we go on in life. He remains a ger as long as there was no mecha, meaning as long as he continues in his way. That's what I think is pshat in Tosfos.
But he doesn't know how he says no mecha, he just doesn't know.
That's what I'm telling you, that imecha is not a Kabbalah's mitzvahs. For sure not. Imecha just means that when we were Megayer 13 years ago, based on the assumption that he would continue to do mitzvahs, we're not going to be Megayer someone who's not going to fulfill mitzvahs. With all the respect, I don't want to mention the rabbi who just passed away recently, but we have to be Megayer someone because we know and we assume, at least we can assume, that he's going to be fulfilling the mitzvahs. But lo and behold, the man becomes a gadol, and he tells you, I'm not interested in doing the mitzvahs. Such a person, we never would have been Megayer.
So you're saying that according to Tosfos, Bezdin supplies the Kabbalah's mitzvahs?
Not really. What I'm suggesting is that Bezdin could be Megayer Katan. Basically, they could be Megayer Gadol. They could be Megayer even a guy Gadol. And the guy goes into the mikveh, and he's mal, and he's a ger. The only problem is that since he's a bardas, he could say, I don't want it. And we're not going to be Megayer and Balkarcha. In the case of a Katan, he's not a bardas, so he can't say, I don't want it. But when he becomes a bardas, at that moment, we have to see, does he want to continue as a Jew? Does he not want to continue as a Jew? But again, I don't think that we have to notify him that he's a ger, schlep him in front of a bezdin, and have him do a formal Kabbalah's whole mitzvahs. Because if that would be the case, then I think the gerus until this point was not a real gerus.
So you're suggesting a new definition of what Kabbalah's mitzvahs is?
I'm suggesting that at least in the case of a Katan, you don't need a Kabbalah's whole mitzvahs. Maybe not even in the case of a gadol. As long as we know it's not against his will, we cannot be the koach bezdin that Rav Huda is talking about to be megayer a guy is conditional on the fact that it's not against his will. Why? Because if it's against his will, then there's no point to this whole enterprise.
The gerus does not require a formal Kabbalah's mitzvah.
Correct.
As long as we know that it's not he's not anti-mitzvah.
Correct. As long as it's lo michu, then we continue with the original gerus, and the original gerus is chal. And his status with Kedusha Yisrael from the get-go, when he was two days old, continues even after he becomes a gadol, as long as he continues in his way. Because otherwise, if he doesn't continue in his way, then it becomes bal karcha. We don't need a Kabbalah soul mitzvahs in front of a bezdin. We need that it shouldn't be bal karcha. In the case of a gadol, if the guy is 13 years old plus, we can't be megayer him if he objects to it. But we never required a formal Kabbalah soul mitzvahs in front of a bezdin.
It seems to me that in this track, that Tosfos has a totally separate track for Katan, because he like as you were saying, we quoted from before. He's madgish that he's zoche batzmo ubegufo. The fact that they did that the milah was done, the fact that the tefillah was done, without requiring das and based in all these and zachin. So so maybe also the Kabbalah mitzvot is a different type of Kabbalah mitzvot, that because he started the whole thing as a katan and where he didn't have das, so he just has it's sort of easier to make him a ger. You've less of a requirement with Mila and Tefillah. You don't need Beis Din
Right.
involved there.
This is
And
the
here
part-
also.
This is the part that I'm vacillating about. Would the same definitions and mechanics apply if the guy was a god? That's what I don't know. Would we suffice with imacha, or do we need a formal Kabbalah?
So I'm guessing. Okay, I'm being bad about this, but I'm guessing not, because I
What does
understand
it mean not that
that it would be different.
different?
Because with a gadol, he has das. In order to change this guy with a das into a Jew, you need to have zachin lo, and you need to have a Beis Din, you need to have all these things that are more, and the Kabbalah or mitzvot has to be a real one, a formal one, as you say. Whereas maybe with the Katan, because he doesn't have das, so it's easier to do. He does the milah, he does the tefillah. So now we need a sort of just to get him going.
And where else do we find the new halacha as far as Katan?
Like in the other Rambam,
in the Rambam Hilchos Havodah.
the Yerushalmi thing.
So there is a breakthrough. I want to tell you about something that could maybe make you smile. Tosas and
I'm smiling
Yevamis, if you want to write this down, Tosas and Yevamis on Daf Mem Hayamid Beis, if you want to write this down. Dibra Maskal Milo Tovlo Linidusa. Tosas says that you need a Kabbalah of all mitzvahs in front of a bezdin in order to achieve Gerus. So I thought to myself, is that Tosfos against our Tosfos and Sanhedrin? Is there a machlokas between two Tosfos? Tosfos and Sanhedrin requires, as you say, a formal Kabbalah or mitzvahs for Gerus in front of Beis Din, whereas Tosfos and Sanhedrin says, no, all you need is imacha. And perhaps the answer is that Tosfos and Sanhedrin is talking about a goy gadol. He's not a Katan. He's a bardas, and in the case of bardas, we need das for gerus. But when Beis Din has a certain superior power with regard to a ger katan, to be megayah the katan, and the gufo, hamila vatfila begufo v'nasa ger likonis hakas kafi ashchina. In such a case, we don't need das, and we can be megayah him just with one condition, and that is in the small print here, that we have to assume that he will continue as a Jew and observe the mitzvahs when he becomes
And that in fact he does.
And in fact he does. But higdilu sha'achas v'lo michu shuveni yachal limchos. Why shuveni yachal limchos? Because we're not dealing with zachin liyad b'shol b'fana.
You're hooked.
But we were makada. He now enters into kedushas Yisrael, and he can't remove that kedushas Yisrael. So that one critical moment will determine whether he's kadosh b'kedushas Yisrael. And once having determined that, because lo michu, then shuven yichol limchos, then you can't be mafkia the gerus. That's what I thought.
Funny because the notes of the post would say at the back of the notes of the post that he's not a care.
Where's this biriatosis?
Yeah, like I say, get man, I actually thought
Ache? Right. But I don't know if he's aware of our analysis here, but he doesn't say that you need a Kabbalah soul mitzvahs. So he's not against what I said. I don't know if he was at all sensitive to our discussion.
Right.
No, there's a tremendous nafkamina here. Do we have to notify a Ger Katan that he was converted? If you require a Kabbalah all mitzvahs in front of a Beis Din, then for sure he has to know about it. And not only that, you have to bring him into Beis Din. I mean, the love this is going to be very difficult. Until now, we had a Gerus without Kabbalah soul mitzvahs. And now we need Gerus because he's a Bardas with Kabbalah soul mitzvahs. So what happened, in that split second between stage 1 and stage 2? But the way we're saying it, all those problems disappear. Because we're not talking about a Kabbalah soul mitzvahs.
How do we from that shita when he was a Katan?
All right, you're right. I guess maybe we'll have to work. We'll have to operate with chazakas. You're right. We have to assume that we shouldn't let him do shchita. Or we operate with chazakas, and we assume he won't be mocha. We educated him. We brought him up. He's a happy child. You know what I mean? That's what I think. Now, again, you could always ask me, in the case of Beis Din Matbilan so in a Katan, we definitely need for Gerus a Maisa Mila and a Maisa Tvila as a Maisa Gerus. And the Katan is a La Bardas. So how does Bezin effectuate a Maisa Gerus? I mean, again, he did a Mila, he did a Tvila, but is that a Maisa Gerus when he's a Katan? And we're saying now that Gerus is going to generate Kedushas Yisrael for the rest of his life, as long as he doesn't make a Macha. When he's a Bardas, he has the option to tell us, thank you, rabbis, you're very nice, but you made a boo-boo, I'm not interested. Not that he knows he's a ger, he's just not interested in Shmiras HaMitzvos. That I can tolerate. But what I find very difficult here in this sugya is how can Bezdin upgrade a physical act of Mila and Tvila into a Maisa Gerus when there's no Das, when a Katan is a Labar Das. So again, the only answer is what we said before, that there's some sort of power and authority that vested in Bezdin that they could effectuate a Maisa Gerus. They convert this and upgrade it to a Maisa Gerus. And once a Maisa Gerus, it generates Gerus and Kedushas Yisrael Doraisa. Just that the whole premise of Bezdin was that he would continue. So now we have to figure out, and we have one moment to figure that out and determine. Does he have to know that he was misguided? He doesn't even have to know, because we're not talking about a formal Kabbalah mitzvahs. Okay, then?
How can you say there's no mecha until he knows? You can't say there was no mecha because he doesn't know, then you can't say that's.
Wait, were you talking as a katan or when he becomes a gadol?
When he becomes a gadol.
So he becomes a gadol,
So
all we need to know.
He didn't know.
All we need to know that he's continuing in the way. We effectuate the gerus generates Kedushas Yisrael, and that we're able to do, but we had a Tanai in mind. We had a condition that he would continue as a Jew. Let's just see if we were successful in raising him as a Jew. If we were, then the gerus was kal from the day one. Because Bezdin made the Tefillah and the Mila into a Maisa Gerus. They upgraded it to the status of a Maisa Gerus.
But how do we know he's continuing because he's not mochad? Maybe he's continuing because things that he's.
It's irrelevant. If you need a Kabbalah soul mitzvahs, you're right. If he doesn't know he's a ger, where's the Kabbalah mitzvahs? But if we're saying we don't need a Kabbalah mitzvahs, and basically be megayarim in the absence of Kabbalah mitzvahs through Mila and Tefillah, just that Bezdin wants to make sure that, as I said before, we were successful in raising him. That's called sha'achas. That sha'achas will clinch and convince us that we made the right decision, and the gerus was effective.
So essentially, you don't need.
How does it look like on the clock? All right, we're not looking too great, which is okay with me. But what I would like to do now is just touch on the next sugya, now that we're finished with this sugya, that I'd like to study with. Now, I'm going to be a real chutzpahdik and ask you if you could find a little time. I know your schedules are very busy, and I'm sure you have other limudim and other shiurim. But if possible, I'd like you to fill in some of the blanks here, because I'll tell you what, I really want to get to the sugya of Rov. Where's the sugya of Rov? Right, it's in Chulin Daf Yud Aleph, but it's also here in Perek Ben Sorer Umor. Just give me a second to find it. Some of them. So I'll tell you where to start. And this is where we'll start in Mitzvah Hashem next week. On Daf Samach Tes Amud Aleph, and you count down from the wide lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you'll see a Gemara Yosef Rabbi Yaakov Minar Pkot. Do you have that? So if you can make a note of it, the only thing you'll have to fill in order to make sense out of this Gemara is the statement of Rav Krospidoi, which you'll find let's see if I can explain. You see, there are thin lines, there are shorter lines. So if you count up from the shorter lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is approximately 15 lines down from the top of the Amud, you'll see Amarav Kruspidoi. Kol Yamav Shal Ben Soru More Eino El Gimel Chadoshim Bilvad. Now, just remember that a Ben Sorer whose Roy Leos Av is excluded from the Chiyuv of Ben Sorer More. And according to Rav Kruspidoi, if let's say immediately after he had Shtei Saras, because again, he can't impregnate a woman before he's a gadol, but let's say immediately on the same day that he had Shtei Saras, he would impregnate a woman, then we would know about it within 3 months. Do you remember what that's called by any chance? That's called Hukar HaUbar, what we call it in our language, she shows, right? So the assumption of Kruspidoi is that as soon as those 3 months pass, he becomes Roy Leos Av, and the Torah calls him a Ben, and therefore he's excluded from the Parsha Ben Sorumor. And the sugya we're about to learn here of Rav Yaakov Minar Pkod is going to talk about what we call a premature birth. And if a woman gives birth after 7 months, then we should not be waiting a full 3 months to knock him out of Roy Leos Av, because he's already Roy Leos Av after 2 and a fraction of months. We'll see exactly how much as we go through the sugya, but the Gemara is going to now introduce the concept of rov, that most women give birth after carrying to a full term, a full 9 months. Hence, Rav Kruspidoi comes up with the number 3 months. Okay, then. So I'll wish you all a great week, and see if you can just learn those few lines of Gemara, so that you'll be, up to
Maybe send us a reminder on Monday.
Monday.
Maybe send us a
Okay,
reminder.
believe it. I'll try to do that.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.